folks. So welcome to today's presentation. Today we'll be talking about the psychoanalytic approach. We're actually entering the first lens through which we understand personality, and we'll specifically look at Freud's theory, application, and assessment. And as you can see, this is Sigmund Freud working hard. So the outline for today's presentation is we will start by introducing the 5 waves of psychology. We'll look at Freud's discovery of the unconscious, the Freudian theory of personality, the different theories that Freud proposed and published, and we'll look at the application value of psychoanalysis as well as some of the assessments that came out of this school of thought. And last but not the least, we'll look at both the pros and the cons of the Freud's theory and summarize them at the end. So the main purpose of introducing the 5 waves of psychology is to help you see the place of psychoanalysis in the context of where things were coming from and in basically the context of psychology as a field. So we all know that it began with the first wave, which was introspection. We know the famous William Wundt and William James' work on structuralism and functionalism, and it was followed by Gestalt psychology, which was wave 2, led mainly by Max Wertheimer, where the focus was not so much on the feelings, but the whole of an experience, so how we experience the world as a whole. And then the third wave is when psychoanalysis came into the picture. And so this is sort of the main point of this slide. In the early 1900s, the wave was started by Sigmund Freud. During this time, it was believed that true feelings comes from a place called the unconscious. The only ways to get into the conscious were through dreams or hypnosis. And after this wave, we all know that, we had behaviorism come in, the eclectic treatments have come in, like ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, and things like that, mindfulness, etc. So our main focus is going to be here today, okay? So a little bit about Freud. Freud was born in Czech Republic and was a Viennese neurologist, which is a medical doctor who treats diseases of the nerves. Freud was a respected member of the medical community. His interest began to drift. In 1885, he went to Paris to study with another neurologist. And that's where he met Jean-Martin Charcot, who was Freud's very close mentor. Charcot was experimenting with early versions of hypnosis and its use in curing what were then believed to be unusual physiological problems. Shortly thereafter, Freud returned to Vienna and began work with a prominent physician, Joseph Breuer. Like Charcot, Breuer was using hypnosis to treat hysteria. Hysterical patients display a variety of physical symptoms, like blindness, deafness, inability to walk and use an arm. And hysteria, by the name of it, back then, it was used to describe extreme emotional excesses. So maybe you could say someone who's very high on neuroticism in today's world, but that's what hysteria basically describes. And female hysteria was once actually a common medical diagnosis for women, which was described as exhibiting a wide array of symptoms, including anxiety, shortness of breath, fainting, nervousness, sexual desire, insomnia, fluid retention, irritability, loss of appetite, sexually forward behavior, and a tendency to cause trouble for others. So, what Freud learned from Charcot and Breuer and what appealed to him were sort of their experiments in the field of hysteria and using hypnosis to treat hysteria. And he came across this case called Anna O. It's a very famous case. She was actually one of Breuer's patients. Her real name was Bertha Pappenheim, but for the sake of confidentiality, they called her Anna O. Anna O was probably she is the one who set the direction for the rest of Freud's career, because after working with her, Freud was like, oh gosh, I have to start this field called psychoanalysis. And I mean, I'm just kidding. He didn't really say that, but he sort of navigated towards that direction. So Anna O experienced a number of hysterical symptoms, including paralysis of her left arm, hallucinations, the ability to speak only in other languages, and even though her native tongue was German. So, all of these like weird things were happening with her. And under hypnosis, Anna O would talk about her daydreams, hallucinations, and about past traumatic events. During her final hypnosis session, she discussed her dying father and some associated hallucinations about a black snake. After this session, the paralysis in her arm was gone and she could once again speak German. So, how interesting is that? From this experience, Freud actually realized the importance of allowing patients to speak whatever came to their mind. And that's what began this thing called free association, which is um, so patients are allowed to speak whatever comes to their mind, whatever their traumatic sexual experiences are, many of that have occurred in early childhood. And once they're able to do that, all the description of this hidden material by patients, that comes out and it kind of like clears the way. And Freud thought that that cured hysterical symptoms. And it was a very new concept and something that was revolutionary actually, this concept that Freud had come up with. So, in today's world, hypnosis is actually a genuine therapeutic tool. You would be surprised. It can be used as an alternative medical treatment for several conditions like depression, insomnia, pain management. It is important that you use a certified hypnotist and hypnotherapist so that you can trust the guided hypnosis process. They will create a structured plan to help you reach your individual goals. So, just a fun fact that I felt like sharing. So, a lot of people in our field, especially now that we're moving so much towards like the hardcore scientific evidence and scientific exploration, there's a lot of criticism about Freud's theories, and of course, it was the 1900s and it's the classical psychoanalysis, right? But I do want you to, keep in mind that he was in his own way a genius. Like it's not easy to like come up with an original idea. Like people live all their lives and don't even come up with one single original idea. And this guy, he really observed the world and he came up with so many theories and just imagine writing books and books and books. And this is just an example of like how many books he wrote over the years. And these aren't just like few pages. They're like 200, 700 big pages books. So it's very important to know and be able to see and with an open mind what he had to offer and read the stuff and have sort of your own critique on it, but not be completely like patronizing towards it, because at the end of the day he did initiate this field. I highly recommend this book by him, The Interpretation of Dreams. So here are some of my recommendations if you want to acquaint yourself with Freud's work, as well as Freudian, his own books that he's written. So Freud's Interpretation of Dreams is a very, very intriguing book. There's another book if you're interested in learning about the unconscious mind. It's called Dynamics of Development by Richard Lasky. The Unconscious by Joel Weinberger. He practices at Adelphi University. Dr. Lasky is associated with the William Allinson White Institute, very famous institute on the Upper West Side in Manhattan. And then Freud and Beyond is a great text for those who are interested in what happened beyond Freud. All the Neo-Freudians that came up, you could see their names like listed here. It was written by Mitchell and Black. Very good book. And then this work, I think it's a podcast, Psychological Significance of the Biblical Series by Jordan Peterson. He talks a lot about sort of the unconscious underpinnings of human behaviors, human belief systems, and things like that. So highly recommend those. That actually brings us to the very first of Freud's theories, the basis of where psychoanalysis began. So think about it this way: the physical birth of a child is marked by anatomical and physiological separation from the mother. And the psychological birth of a child is marked by mental representations of these anatomical considerations derived from physiological experiences or processes. Freud understood that the unconscious system's effort at expression of wishes as an attempt to discharge instinctual energy, right? And so there is this Freud knew that there is this sort of, we have these mental representations of biological substrate or somatic stimuli that are affectively charged and seek to be discharged through goal oriented behaviors. He said that the buildup of such energy or the prevention of its discharge is experienced as discomfort, but its release is experienced as pleasure. And so he termed it the term called pleasure principle. So, put in simple terms, he said that when a child comes to experience the world, let's say a baby is hungry, right? So there is a physiological component to hunger, but then there's also the psychological component. So the baby feels sad, the baby doesn't feel like love, the baby feels needy, and so the the mental representations that derive from these biological substrates, from these somatic stimuli, right? Those are what he called drives. Those are instincts, right? And he's in short terms, it was actually called Trieb in German, I think, and in English it translates to drive or instincts. And these are strong internal forces that motivate human behavior. Okay, so when a child really needs his mother's attention, when a child really like needs milk or needs pleasure or things like that. So these are strong internal forces that motivate the human behavior. So when someone really needs something, they would like go do something. Like the child would, maybe sort of do a reflex, like a hand reflex or something to get it. And so that's sort of the beginning. And so Freud categorized drives into two types. He said basically there are all these drives, but they can be categorized into two broad instincts or drives, and they are called libido and thanatos. So libido is the drive that is life enforcing. Okay, so anything that you're working towards, creating life. Okay, or like sex, like eros and thanatos, right? So libido and thanatos is eros and thanatos. So he called one of the drives as the sex drive, and the other drive, which was the thanatos, as the dread drive. That's the destructive drive, the aggressive drive. So for example, at an individual level, the libido or the eros is something that makes you want to strive towards pro-social, um, pro-social attitudes, right? Like love, um, like protection, care, compassion, empathy. All of these are pro-social life drives, like sex. It's something that creates life. And then thanatos are things that are sort of moving towards the destruction, right? So when you do self-harming behaviors, when you are trying to, you know, com- attempt suicide and things like that. So those are examples at the individual level, and some of the examples where libido and thanatos manifest at the um, collective level, at the society level, at the level of like the communities is, people who have, like, let's say life drive at the level of community, and that exhibits itself could be something like, a whole bunch of people protesting for peace, or um, people who do revolutionary acts like Martin Luther King, and things that lead people in a positive direction as a collective whole. That's how libido expresses itself in our world, in a collectivist way. And thanatos is something when you see terrorism, when you see um, mass shootings in schools. Those are all like thanatosis, if that's even a word. It's like thanatos based expressions of these drives across the collective human society. And so, for you to just like keep it simple, know that we have two different drives that Freud proposed. It was divided into libido, the life drive, and thanatos, the death drive. So most human behavior is attributed to the life or sexual instinct, includes action aimed at receiving pleasure. That instinct is turned outward and expressed as aggression against others. The wish to die remains unconscious. Early traumatic sexual experiences were responsible for hysterical symptoms expressed by adult patients, and Freud started what was known as the Viennese Psychoanalytic Society, and they started this whole new school of thought which talked about the unconscious mind and these drives and all the other things that we'll cover in today's presentation. So the most important sort of teaching that Freud um, proposed was the topographic model of personality. And in this model, personality is divided into different levels of awareness. Okay, so there's this conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious. The conscious level is the thoughts a person is currently aware of. The pre-conscious is the retrievable information, and the unconscious is thoughts that cannot be easily brought into awareness except under extreme conditions. So the unconscious, what you're thinking of at any given moment, right? Like, for example, now I'm thinking of what I'm teaching in this presentation. The preconscious is sort of what I'm retrieving from my own memory reservoir, right? And then the unconscious is like thoughts that are not really easily coming up, but the reason I might be expressing myself the way I am is because certain unconscious proclivities are going on in somewhere in my mind right now. And so all of these work together to create our personality manifestation in any given moment of time. Then Freud said that that's not enough to just talk about the unconscious, preconscious, sub and conscious. There is more to it. It's not just that. There is more to understanding personality. And so he came up with what was called the structural model, and it divides personality into the id, the ego, and the superego. And the id is the part, the personality structure that you're born with at birth, according to Freud. And these are actions that are based on pleasure principle and wish fulfillment. So it is like the baby part of you, which always wants something. As soon as you crave it, you want it. You're hungry, you want it right now, right? So that's the id. The ego is the part that tries to satisfy the id impulses, but also takes into consideration the realities of the world. So actions under the ego are based on the reality principle. So the goal is to be realistic. In under the id, the goal is to like seek pleasure. Under here, it's to be realistic. Like, okay, I might be hungry, but I'm in a meeting right now, so I'm not just gonna grab the donuts in the middle of the table and start eating them, right? So that's the ego part of the person's personality. And then comes the superego, which represents society's values and standards, sort of your moral compass, and um, the main sort of goal of the superego is to prevent moral anxiety, right? And so if you feel that it's a bad thing to just grab the donuts and eat it, it shows that you're a selfish person, you're insensitive, you're not a good team worker. So if you have that type of moral belief system, then the superego comes into place, and it's like, no, no, don't jump for those donuts. Keep your composure. And so those are just simple examples of how the id, ego, and superego parts of personality manifest in certain areas of life. So this is a very nice iceberg model of both the structural and topographical model of Freud's personality. As you can see, the tip is the conscious, which we're all aware of. The preconscious is near the tip, but not really. And then the unconscious is sort of where the ego, id, and superego reside. The id is way, way below down there, and the ego and superego is sort of like still up here. So right at the level of awareness. So the other important thing that Freud proposed was defense mechanisms. And these are techniques of the ego to deal with unwanted thoughts and desires to reduce or avoid anxiety. So what comes to mind when you talk about defenses? What is a defense? A defense is an unconscious ego function, right? So your ego is always trying to help you be more realistically oriented in the world, be more presentable in your social group. And so what happens when you're not able, when the ego suppresses your id? You experience this thing known as anxiety. And in order to sort of cope with that anxiety, we end up using defense mechanisms. So, mechanisms that help us overcome anxiety. And so, one of the first defense mechanisms is repression. And this is an active effort by the ego to push threatening material out of consciousness. It requires constant expenditure of energy, because repression, you're like consciously trying to no, that's suppression. So in repression, you're like pushing threatening material out of the consciousness, but you're not even conscious of that. Or you might be conscious for a few milliseconds and then it disappears, right? So something like maybe having like sexually inappropriate thoughts against something that society doesn't approve of, and that is sort of, immediately it's pushed down, and it's like below your awareness even. So the second is sublimation, and this is channeling threatening unconscious impulses into socially acceptable actions. And so sublimation is more like, okay, if you're having some impulses, instead of acting on them, which is not allowed by society or by, your own sort of upbringing and whatnot, you channel it towards doing more socially appropriate things, like let's say an artist who cannot express their sexuality fully ends up drawing nude paintings, something like that, which is more socially acceptable. Or let's say another example would be someone who is not able to, just go out and be aggressive with people, ends up, learning boxing or something like that. So it's productive in nature. Now, displacement is when you channel impulses to non-threatening objects. So here, the displaced impulses do not lead to social rewards. So let's say you are angry with something made you angry, you cannot express that, it's making you anxious, so you end up going and turning that anger towards your younger sibling, who is less threatening. So here is an example of football players who might be engaging in sublimation. Instead of being aggressive overall, they could just, like be aggressive on the field, which is more socially acceptable. And then denial is also one of a famous defense mechanism. It's refusal to accept that certain facts exist. Extreme form of defense. It makes a person less realistic. So let's say a guy is in a narcissistic, abusive relationship with someone, and he knows that it's bad for him. It's not helping him in his life, but still he keeps staying in that relationship because of something known as denial. It's just too hard for him to come to terms with reality that, this is what has happened in his life. And so he chooses, even beyond his conscious awareness, to just believe that it's not even true. And but it's a defense when the truth soon catches up to it. That's how you're using a defense mechanism, because one of the questions that you might come up or think about is, okay, if it's a defense mechanism, how do you know it's a defense mechanism? Because it's kind of like the truth soon catches up with you. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like that. And then reaction formation is also another defense mechanism. It's acting in a manner opposite to threatening unconscious desires. And so let's say you feel like you hate someone, but then you will like go and try to be best friends with them, and think that you really really love them. So it's kind of a compensatory mechanism. Like if you really really like hate someone, you don't want you're not it's not a good thing to really really hate someone, so instead of hating them, you will really really love them, or something like that. So you choose something that's more socially acceptable. Okay. And I'll give you an example of reaction formation as well. So for example, let's say sexual abuse, right? Or even Stockholm syndrome. Like the person who is being abused actually does not like the abuser. It's like 100% truth to it. Like, why would anyone like someone who abuses them, right? But then they keep loving them, they keep liking them, because that's the best way to deal with that anxiety of, being treated unfairly. It's reaction formation. So people who have been sexually abused as children by, let's say, like an uncle or a parent, they end up, loving their parent and hating themselves. It's more like it should be the opposite. They should love themselves, hate the parent, or the uncle or whoever the perpetrator is, but they do the opposite so they can overcome the anxiety. And so kids, they often turn the hatred towards themselves, and so they grow up with like not very high self-esteem. They could have, all of these self-esteem issues and things like that. So it's very important to like be aware of these defenses and which ones you might have used in your own life. The others are intellectualization, so removal of emotional content from the thought. So a lot of people who are more towards the reasoning side, they usually use this defense mechanism. So instead of saying, oh, like, this person hurt me so much, instead of like acknowledging it or being like, that really hurts, they could be like, oh, no biggie, pain, like it's it's not a big deal, like I'm feeling anxious, it's just the chemicals in my brain, and then it's gonna go away by tomorrow. So something like that. It's just another simple example. And then projection is attributing unconscious impulses to other people. So let's say you feel jealous of someone, and then you feel like they feel jealous of you. And so projection is projecting your own sort of feelings onto someone, or feeling like someone is projecting their feelings on you when it's actually you who feels that way. And so this is a quick table summarizing everything together in more sort of explicit manner for you to read, and some more examples. And the next thing we're going to talk about is psychosexual stages of development. So Freud also proposed this. He said that adult personalities of people are greatly influenced by the events of early childhood, and the sequence of development is made up of stages characterized by primary erogenous zones and sexual desires. So as people are growing up, they have these stages of growth, and each stage has specific influence on the adult personality. And so he divided the stages of development into oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. And this is a very nice table that puts everything into perspective, but I'll give you the first example. So oral is from birth to 18 months old, where the physical focus is on the mouths, the lips, the tongues. This is like the primary erogenous zone, like when a kid is first starting to navigate in the world, when a baby is navigating in the world, the mouth is being used to, like gain awareness of the surroundings, everything the baby puts in its mouth. And so it said that when a baby like gets fixated in this stage of development, then the psychological theme is usually dependence. You become passive as your personality. That's the kind of personality that develops. The adult character types, you become dependent or overly independent. So it can go in either directions. The same with anal. Remember how you could describe somebody, oh, he's being so anal. So it's a similar concept. So the ego is when the relevant mental structure under this stage. The anus and organs of elimination are the physical focus, and the psychological theme is learning how to obey, learning self-control, and if things go right, you gain a balance. If things don't go right, you get fixated. Either you become too obedient, like fascist, or too inobedient, like like a rebel, or in the chaotic side, right? Like anarchy or nihilism and those aspects. Then comes phallic, latency, and genital, and the similar themes are here too. You have the superego development, you have gender identity, if something doesn't develop, you become over or under sexualized, and so on and so forth. The only thing here is in latency period, Freud said nothing really happens. It's kind of like learning and cognitive development, but a lot of professors and researchers have said that a lot is also happening during this time. And then the last is the genital stage, where you have the mature adult. So this is a bit more about these facets. You can read at your pace from this graph. It's pretty self-explanatory, and this is a bit more like clarity on where these stages are, the months, the developmental tasks, and sort of what happens if certain things don't develop, like dependency, obsessiveness, competitiveness, and things like that. So this is a slide that briefly puts forth the oral stage, the first 18 months. The erogenous zones is the mouth, lips, and tongue. Fixation is basically stagnation of psychic energy. So result when a child is unable to move through that particular stage, that's when you're sort of stuck in that stage of life. And let's say you were a kid and you had problems eating, then you as a grown up, you would start biting your nails. You would be fixated with that oral cavity. And so maybe you would smoke a lot, maybe you would drink a lot. All of these are part of those oral personalities. And so these are just things that Freud proposed. You can contend with it, but these are sort of the themes that follow through across the stages. Oedipus complex, we all know that. Boys develop like attraction towards the mother, girls develop towards the father. And what happens is if they don't form a healthy attachment, there's a disruption there, and it could really impact the child's identity, sexual identity, gender identity, and all of those facets of life. And if it's resolved, if it has a, how do you say, a healthy resolution, then the child comes to identify with the father, love the mother in healthy ways, versus like hate the father and want the mother in unhealthy ways. So this is sort of like what the classical psychoanalytic school proposes. And so after resolution of the Oedipus complex, children pass into latency stage for several years. Boys will prefer to play with other boys, girls with other girls. All of this ends with puberty. We have the latency stage, the genital stage. We've already spoken about that. The genital stage is when you have that more mature type of sexuality, when the genital regions are the primary focus. So the conceptions of personality can be divided into three models in the psychoanalytic school of thought: topographical, psychosexual, and structural. So getting at the unconscious material, we looked at how we have the unconscious, the subconscious, and the conscious mind. And now we'll look at how can we understand this, right? And so some of the techniques to understand unconscious are dreams, right? So Freud said dreams are the royal road to the unconscious mind. So if you've read the interpretation of dreams, you will understand that Freud proposed dreams as wish fulfillments. A lot of people say that dreams are just these random occurrences of, your mind sort of reconfiguring, your brain sort of reconfiguring itself, and whatever, like leftovers come through. However, if you have ever really been into like dreaming and like understanding how dreams work, you will see that dreams are extremely structured. Like within the unstructured component, the symbolic meaning is very structured. It is very interesting to analyze dreams, because they really give you insights into what's going on in your mind, what's going on in your subconscious mind. For instance, one of my friends, she's really one of my close best friends, is getting involved in like some very precarious political things, and although upfront I'm supportive of her and things like that, I get dreams where I see her surrounded by like these dangerous creatures all around, like alligators and stuff. And so to me, that dream meaning is saying that I am subconsciously afraid for her safety, even though at a conscious level I'm being strong and courageous. So that's just an example of how meaningful dreams are in terms of giving us an idea of what is actually going on in our subconscious mind. Projective tests are second way of getting into our unconscious mind. The idea is that people identify objects, tell a story, draw a picture, whatever their interpretation of it is, and then you see what's actually going on in their mind based on what they're doing, what they're projecting out into the world. Then we have free association, which we spoke about earlier, where the person just talks about whatever oozes out of their mind. There's no censorship as what as like what there's no censorship at all, and then this exposes like parts of themselves that they were probably trying to suppress. The other is Freudian slips. So these are misstatements or slips of the tongue, may represent unconscious associations. So instead of saying, I really love that dress, you don't really love that dress, you could say, I really, you know, hate that dress or something like that, which could be a very like it's a very simple example, but you get the gist. Like sometimes instead of saying something, you say something else, and you might have also come up with experiences like this, and you're like, oops, I don't know where that came from, but that kind of depicts what may actually be going on in your mind. Um, then hypnosis, we've already talked about this. It bypasses the ego, gets directly at the unconscious material. And then we have something as accidents, right? Intentional action stemming from the unconscious. So sometimes you just say something and then you're like, oops, I don't know why I said that, but it came from a place that I didn't even know it was there, but I think it was needed to come. So those are all examples of how we can get at the unconscious material. Symbolic behavior are daily behaviors that can be interpreted as symbolic representations of unconscious desires, right? So, also sometimes the way you stand, the way you sit, the way your hand gestures, all of those are also like symbolically oriented and may reflect the unconscious mind. So, the primary goal of psychoanalysis, when we look at the application value, is to focus on uncovering the unconscious and bringing it into the conscious realm of the client, so the client can contend with this repressed stuff. The main reason the way psychopathology is explained under the psychoanalytic school of thought is that the person is trying to repress like these things that make them anxious to such an extent that it leads to psychopathology. And so if you're able to help the person uncover these hidden materials, then the person gets the chance to become a fully integrated human being. And so the primary goal is to bring crucial unconscious material into consciousness for rational examination. And unconscious material must be dealt in a manner to avoid manifestations of new disorders. So in a psychotherapeutic room, you have to do it in a way that you are sort of stabilizing the patient as well. It doesn't just happen all at once, because then that will just shock the patient and send them into other types of psychopathologies. And so one of the if you've ever gone through your own psychoanalytic treatment, you will see that psychoanalysis is literally like viewing the person under the microscope. Everything is game. Like even the silence in the room has meaning, has symbolic meaning. Like, why is the person silent? Like, what does the silence signify? So everything in a psychoanalytic framework is game. Like, it means that everything is analyzable. And so you will see that if you go to a psychoanalyst office, they don't even do much small talk, because they see that small talk is interfering with being able to analyze how the person is exhibiting themselves within that framework, within that dynamic. So it's application wise, it is, although it's a very powerful technique, it is very expensive. It takes several hours, several years to really bring the unconscious into the conscious awareness. And it's sort of like going towards creating meaningful structural changes within the person. And that takes time. It's not like CBT or DBT where you teach people tools and they follow the tools, and it can be helpful in the here and now, but like true meaningful structural changes happen in the long term. And another thing to understand is when resistances come up, that's also very important to see in therapeutic settings. Like if a client is resisting something, that is also telling you, like, what's he trying to hide? Like, what is going on here? Why is the person resisting this so much? There is like this unconscious defense mechanism or something like that. So it's very important to have an awareness of those facets of your thinking. Transference is also a very famous concept, displacing emotions associated with people from the past situations onto the therapist. And it can also, and countertransference, sort of like displacing what the therapist feels towards the client. Um, so, in simple terms, transference can happen with anyone. So, it's basically the dynamics that you learn growing up with your parents that kind of come through in all your dynamics growing up. And so, you can see someone on the street and suddenly feel love for them because it might remind you of your grandmother or something, and that's an example of transference. You, whatever feelings you feel towards your grandmother, you're simply transferring those feelings onto this new person. And so that's what transference means. And countertransference is, let's say the person on the street looks like your grandma, and then you're being all this affectionate and stuff towards them, which is like very weird if you just randomly do that to someone on the street. But imagine if they sort of do a countertransference, they reflect that back at you. They're like, oh, she's so affectionate, like, oh, I feel like I should be affectionate too to her. And so there's like this transference countertransference kind of dynamic. So, studies indicate that psychoanalytic therapies are effective in treating several psychological disorders, and resistance and transferences, all of these are very important mechanisms to be noticed in the therapeutic room. Um, I think the last thing we're going to touch upon is the assessments and projective tests. So, how many of you've heard of Rorschach ink blot tests? These are those tests that you'll find they look like bat ink structures on paper, on index cards, and these predict behavior from responses on ink blots. They were designed by Hermann Rorschach. The thematic apperception test is a test where you look at a series of ambiguous pictures and you tell a story. And then the human figure drawing test is also you draw stuff, and it measures intelligence and personality constructs and things like that. So all of these personality tests put together, the crux is basically whatever the client is saying, doing, revealing is giving you a glimpse of their internal frame of mind. And so, although projective tests are helpful to know, it's very good to club them with objective tests. So, projective tests with other type of testing is always a very good combination. So you see, this is a Rorschach ink blot test. The psychologist administering one of the most widely used personality tests. The participant tells him what she sees on her card, whether these response provides a valid assessment. So let's say she comes in with a depressive mood. She can say, oh, I see that this is a tunnel and there's someone hiding inside the tunnel, right? And so her responses kind of help the psychologist to gauge her internal frame of mind. Let's say someone comes in with the happiest mood ever, and they are psychologically high functioning, healthy, well put together. They look at this card and they're like, oh, it looks like a bat, or it looks like a butterfly, or something like that. So those are very helpful projections that the client is revealing. This is an example of what the human figure drawings by emotionally disturbed children. So you can see like children from refugee camps. So they have drawn themselves behind bars. They have drawn themselves within the mother's tummy. The mother is protecting them, the baby, and crying. They've drawn like monsters, like with very huge arms. And so these are just sort of giving you an internal frame of reference, right? That the kid is feeling scared. The kid might be feeling the need for protection, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of criticisms of some of these tests, especially Rorschach. It has low indices of reliability. It doesn't have much evidence, no scientific basis for justifying the use of Rorschach scales. However, it is useful when it's used with other assessments as well, and with special type of coding that's called the Exner method. If you know that, it can be very helpful and also somewhat more reliable. Um, Rorschach text can also be used for social and emotional adjustment, for law enforcement, court officials, and things like that. But the validity of these tests is still remaining open to testing. So, what are the strengths and criticisms of Freud's theory? It's the first comprehensive theory of human behavior and personality. Freud's observations set the direction for subsequent personality theory and research. Freud's techniques have become standard tools for many therapists, and it's promoted important psychological concepts. But the criticisms are that Freud's ideas may not be original, some of his ideas predate his work. Imagine that, right? Maybe they came from, I don't know, his own predecessors. In the interpretation of dreams, you will actually see how he quotes, I think, Aristotle and all of those people. So I'm like, it's very interesting to read that book. Um, and then the hypotheses generated from the theory are not testable because human beings are so subjective under the psychoanalytic school of thought, and they're so complex that you really can't have one size fit them all, because it's just you have to work on a one-on-one basis. And then there's disagreements with the points of emphasis and tones of Freud's theory, which actually brings us to our next presentation after this, where we're going to talk about Neo-Freudians, which are people who initially started under the classical school of thought, but then they diverted. And so here are some summary slides of everything I spoke about. Be sure to look over them at your time when you have the time. All the best.